Just take a second. I just want to make sure that I saved. Okay, I've got it saved. All right. And then what I'm going to be talking about today, as you all know, has to do with maintenance and reserves. And there's been a lot of things happening in our industry. More and more people obviously are thinking about this. Our audience is up to over 50 people now. So more and more people are thinking about this. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to share my screen. And I like to do my webinar so everybody can see me and I can see you guys, even though a lot of you have covered your faces. But if you have any questions, it's hard for me to see in the chat room. I see Jody from my office is here. So Jody, if anything drops into the chat room as far as a question, if you wouldn't mind interrupting me, but you should all feel free to unmute yourself and jump right in. I'm not shy. If it's something I'm going to be covering or I covered already, I'll tell you. So let me get going with the slideshow, and I want to share my screen. Hopefully this will work. It usually does. Okay.
I want them to meet Giorgio first. I want them to meet Lance first. I want them to meet Augustus.
If you guys wouldn't mind muting yourself. Yeah, I think there's a way that I can mute everybody.
Actors that I look up to, the actors that I emulate.
Except I don't know how to do it. Well, I would ask if everybody wouldn't mind muting yourself so you're not over talking me. I would appreciate it. So here we go. I'm going to share my screen. I'll get going with the presentation. Slideshow. Slideshow from beginning. All right, so can everybody see it now? You should be able to see it. If you can't, please let me know. And also what I like to do is at the bottom, I run closed captioning or the texting. And it was very nice. Maybe the reason I do it is because I have a hearing impaired daughter, but the other reason is that every night when I watch TV, I always have the closed caption on because a lot of times I need to hear what they're saying, especially if it's one of these English shows. The other thing is that just a couple of weeks ago, I gave a webinar and I was honored because I had the text on and I got a phone call after the webinar about 10 minutes after from somebody from California who was sitting on it. And the only reason she called was to thank me for putting on the closed captioning because she was hearing impaired and she's never seen it done before. And it really helped her to keep up with what I was talking about. So you'll see it at the bottom and hopefully that helps. So what I'm going to be talking about is maintenance reserves. And as they tie into the newly updated reserve study standards, I'm going to go through them and tell you what the changes are to the standards and how they affect you. I'm going to talk about how reserve studies relate to the newly issued best practices report on maintenance, which was just released at the CAI annual conference in Dallas just last week, along with the reserve study standards. If anybody would like a PDF copy of either one of these, if you email me after the presentation or email Jody from my office, we'll send you a PDF copy of these. What they are and how do they affect your funding, why this will be happening, even if we didn't have the reserve study standards and the report on maintenance, what I'm going to talk about would be happening anyway, and I'll tell you why. And most of the people here are from New Jersey, so I'm going to talk about the New Jersey legislature's requirements when it comes to reserves and maintenance, which are very much based on the National Public Policy paper, which I'll touch on in a few minutes. So for those of you who are not in New Jersey, it's pretty close in relation to the National Public Policy paper. And then the last I'm going to talk about is what can you do about this? What do you do? Since it's going to happen, you have no way around it. A little background about myself, so you will understand that maybe I do know what I'm talking about. When CAI issued the public policy report on condominium safety, I co-chaired that national task force along with somebody else who's here. Steve Marcus is sitting down there somewhere, and there might be somebody else who's involved today who's out there to correct me when I say things. Now, CAI is in the process of updating now, and I'm chairing that task force, which is updating it. Let's see, the task force updated reserve study standards. I was one of the co-chairs of that. The best practices report on reserve studies. I worked on that with a few people from across the country. And I chaired the task force a number of years ago when the National Reserve Study Standards and the Reserve Specialist designation were introduced. The book that CAI puts out, Reserve Funds and How and Why Your Community Association Best Assets, I'm one of the authors. And CAI just released the best practices report on maintenance, which I was one of the 4 people who worked to prepare that. Also, I teach 2 courses, the M370 Managing Developing Communities, which if anybody has a community going through transition, this is a commercial, We're actually offering that as a webinar next Thursday and Friday, and you think you can still go sign up for it through CAI National. There's usually a couple of hundred people that attend that M370 class, and the other one is managing high-rise communities, which I'm one of the instructors on that. So what is our overall vision? And it's to keep our community safe. And this question that I asked kind of answered this also proves it, that the vision is to keep our community safe while maximizing property values. And as you all showed, the most important thing was minimizing your life cycle costs. So that's the vision that we all have. Why did these changes happen? And starting from left to right, you're all familiar with the Surfside collapse that occurred in Florida. I think it's about 2 years ago already. As soon as that happened, within a few weeks, CAI created a task force, which I mentioned before, that myself and Steve Marcus, who's sitting there, were involved with. And it issued a report on condominium safety public policy report, which is used across the country for legislation. There's no question about it, because I'm involved in the legislation in New Jersey as well as in Delaware. And both of those states reached out to us representing CAI to help them put together legislation based on this public policy report. A few things that came out of that was the importance of reserve studies, the importance of maintenance, and the importance of structural integrity inspections. So as a result of this public policy report, CAI issued these 2 reserve study standards on the maintenance, just like I said in the last week. So that's what the evolution was. And you can see how very proactive CAI is on a national basis to make these kind of things happen. So let's jump right in. And what is a reserve study? Now, this didn't really change from the original standards, but I think it's a good starting point. We really need to understand what the definition is. And that is, a reserve study is a budget planning tool. As you can see, I underlined budget planning tool, which identifies the components that a community association is responsible to maintain, remember that, or replace the current status of the reserve fund and a stable and equitable funding plan to offset the anticipated future major common area expenditures. Now, I know from the audience that I see out there, most of you are pretty much familiar with that. If you have any questions about what a reserve study is, I don't think you do, because I think close to 90% of you said that you have a reserve study. So you should understand, hopefully, what a reserve study is. But that's a reserve study. What is maintenance? The reason I like to put this up, because most people think of maintenance as one word, but there are 3 types of maintenance that I'm going to mention as part of this presentation. So I just want to make sure that everybody's aware of what they mean as I use the terms going through the presentation. I'm going to start at the bottom and then go to the top and then go to the middle. Deferred maintenance. Deferred maintenance means you don't do it, you defer it. And it's funny, in this industry, a lot of times the word deferred maintenance is used for putting together a preventive maintenance plan, but you really need to change your terminology, because deferred means you do not do it. Preventive means it's a proactive plan carried out at predetermined intervals aimed at reducing the deterioration of components. One of the things that's important to note about this, and this relates directly back to, by the way, that best practices paper on maintenance, is that preventive maintenance program includes, a big part of that is doing ongoing inspections of the community as part of doing some type of proactive preventive maintenance, such as painting wood and things like that. Now, the last one, which I'm going to touch on, especially when it comes to cost, is corrective maintenance. Corrective maintenance is a type of maintenance that when you go out to do an inspection, and because you haven't done preventive maintenance, you have to fix something. So corrective maintenance is carried out following the detection of a problem with the goal of remediating the problem. But from a cost perspective, I know I'm jumping around a little, because I've learned that in order for people to digest things, sometimes they need to hear it 7 times. So this is time number 1. Corrective maintenance has been shown to cost more than 30 times the cost of preventive maintenance. So if you add up all the preventive maintenance you've done, 5 times 30, that's less than it's going to cost for you to fix something. So from a life cycle cost perspective, you really need to keep that in mind. And you'll see that I'm going to mention that concept a couple of times as part of this presentation. The other term I use a lot is life cycle cost. What does life cycle cost mean? It's the cost of maintaining your community and replacing the components. It's anything that has to do with the physical assets and the costs associated with it. It could be maintaining or replace it. It could be the energy that goes into it. It's all these things that make up the life cycle cost of your community. So when I mention this, that's what I mean by life cycle. The life cycle cost also includes the cost of building a community. But if I'm not mistaken, everybody in this audience is probably involved in an association after it's been turned over from the developer. You've been through transition. And if you have any questions as I'm going along, please feel free, because some of these things do relate to it. But the life cycle cost for you as a manager or a board member or somebody involved in an association starts after turnover. That's when you start paying for things. So, but that's what the terminology life cycle cost means as I'm going through this. So what are the changes to the reserve study standards? Now, the top paragraph here is what I read before, but now this paragraph has been added. This limited evaluation is conducted for budget and cash flow purposes. It's not intended to be an engineering inspection. It's for budget and cash flow purposes. Some firms, such as mine, is an engineering firm, so we use engineers to do the reserve studies. But if you look at the reserve specialists around the country, probably less than half of them are engineers. They're familiar with construction, they're familiar with pricing, they're familiar with all the things it takes to do a budget for a reserve study. But keep in mind, it's a budget, and it's a budget for cash flow purposes. This is new. And when the CAI set up the task force to update the National Reserve Study Standards, what they said was our task was to update the reserve study standards so that they connect to maintenance and they connect to structural integrity. So I'm going to talk about what the connections are in the new standards and how it relates to that. But it says tasks outside the scope of a reserve study include, but are not limited to, design review, construction evaluation, intrusive or destructive testing, preventive maintenance plans, which I'll touch on what the connection is if it's not part of the reserve study, and structural or safety evaluations, which again are not part of the reserve study, but are now directly connected to them. What's the effect that this has on the reserve study? There are absolutely additional disclosures that are required when you do a reserve study. For example, when somebody's doing a reserve study, the two of the disclosures they're asking for are, do you have a preventive maintenance plan in place? And I'll tell you how it impacts everything. And another disclosure would be, are you doing periodic structural inspections, which I'll touch on in a little while. So the result of this could be an increase in the funding of your reserves. So this is the change in terms of actually the definition behind it. The other thing to keep in mind is that when Champlain Towers collapsed, there was a lot of newspaper articles that talked about if they had fully funded their reserves, it wouldn't have happened. One of the things our task force came to immediately was a reserve study is not related to the structure of the building, as I just mentioned, and that if the reserve study was fully funded, and to be honest with you, I don't know if it was or it wasn't, but it would not have had an impact on what happened. So the perception seems to be that if there is a reserve study includes the structure and all is okay, and it doesn't. That is the reason for structural integrity inspections, including corrective maintenance, which I talked about. What's the effect on the reserve study? There's additional disclosures required, and the result could be an increase in funding, which I'm going to touch on. And keep in mind, when I talk about the effect on the reserve study, I'm only talking about the reserve study. I'm not talking about the total package of life cycle costs, which I will get to at the end of this presentation. So what's included? I'm just going to spend a second on this. The physical analysis, and you'll see up there, there's no change in what the physical analysis is, which just lists the components, what the replacement costs are, when they're going to have to be replaced, and all those kind of things. Then there's the financial analysis. There's no change that is still required as part of a reserve study, and it includes different funding plans, full funding, threshold funding, baseline funding, all those type of things. That has not changed. But what about the component inventory selection? How do you select the components? That has absolutely changed. There used to be a 4-part test to do that. It's now been changed to a 3-part test. I'm going to read them. They're hard to understand, but I'm going to go through them as part of this presentation. But it's a 3-part test, and it absolutely has an effect on your reserve study. The first one, the association has the obligation to maintain or replace the existing element. That's pretty clear. That hasn't changed. And essentially, the common elements would be included. The need and schedule for this project can be reasonably anticipated. This is a big change, which I'll talk about in a second. The total cost of the project is material to the association, can be reasonably estimated, and includes all direct and related costs. What this means is, and the change here is, that most people assume that it's only to replace something physical within your community. But now, if there are certain types of inspections that need to be done, like the periodic structural inspections or the update of the reserve study, which I call like an indirect cost or a soft cost, those things are included in the reserve study. Now let's go on to what does it mean for the need and schedule can be reasonably anticipated. This, you're probably all familiar with this, big change. The big change is that the 30-year rule is gone. What 30-year rule meant was that when you did a reserve study, the only components you included are those components that within 30 years of that study will require replacement. So what would happen is that people would have the reserve studies done initially. Everything within 30 years would be included. And then as the community gets older, let's say it's 10 years old, and now it goes out to 40 years because it's 30 years from the date of construction, any component within that 30-year window would now need to be included in the study. The problem was that the original standards that were just updated said that when you did an update of a reserve study, including a field visit, you were essentially updating the prior study. It did not say anything about including these 30-year components in it that fall within that 30-year window now. The new standards are very specific. When you do a reserve study update, including a site visit, any component that now falls within that 30-year window has to be included. It has to be included. And that's part of the update requirements now. So from the effect of the reserve study, it might cost slightly more to have a reserve study done because not only are you updating the prior study, but you're adding to it things that now fall within that 30-year window. So it says those components with an estimated remaining life of more than 30 years from the date of the study being prepared should be included. These are called long life components. These are called long life components. What are your options? Option one is inclusion of the long life component with funding in the study. There was a lot of pushback on that with good reason, because if we start updating all of our studies and even take components that fall out of that 30-year window and start including it, there's going to be a bump in the funding amount. A bump in the funding amount where it's going to jump up because now things outside of that 30-year window are going to be included with funding. So what are your options? Inclusion of those. For updates, I doubt if that's going to be done, but for all new studies that are done for new communities, it should include long life components. Next option is addition of the long life components with funding at the time they fall within the 30-year period from the date of the study preparation. I think this is going to be the most prevalent thing to happen, that the update standards have changed. And now as you're going along and you do a reserve study, the update says that you should include them. And then most people are going to say, okay, when it falls within the 30-year window, we have to include it and funding. The other thing is to identify long life components in the inventory, even though they not yet been funded in 30-year funding plan. This is also going to be done. So what's going to happen is once it falls within the 30 years, it's going to show up and you're going to be funding for it. If it's something that falls out of the 30-year window, but is going to need to be funded when it gets within the 30-year if it's outside of the 30-year window, but once it gets within the 30-year window, it's going to need to be funded. It's going to be shown on the reserve study with a zero cost amount so that everybody knows that when it gets to a certain point, it should start being funded. The effect on the reserve study, this could increase, could increase in the result. It could result in an increase in funding. But this is a pretty significant change that the 30-year rule is gone. How do you decide? It says that long life components should only be included if the need and schedule could be reasonably anticipated. That's what it says in the standards. But what does that mean? I'm just showing up here one standard that shows what useful lives are, and it's pretty specific, so you can include them in the study. I will tell you that most people will not be including the structure of the building, which I'll talk about. In here, it's showing 100-year life. But now if you have treated timber post piles or foundation waterproofing or different things up to, let's say, 50 years, you're going to start seeing them on your study, even if they're outside of the 30-year window with a $0 amount, so they're not funded yet. Let's see. All right, what about energy efficiency? One of our listeners just sent me a text. Let me see. Okay, so now what about energy efficiency? One of the things that's left out when people do reserve studies from a life cycle cost basis is the cost of energy. People generally leave in the study the standard piece of equipment that's there, their standard energy pieces of equipment, and they're left in the study without taking into account the cost of energy. So here's what it says in the standards now. A component replacement is not required to be with a similar component. Logical upgrades to an existing asset or system that is obsolete, inefficient, or no longer effective serves the needs of the association. Serving the need of the association can be accomplished as a reserve project. These upgrades can be based on ongoing preventive maintenance costs and evaluation of energy costs. So in the reserve study, what it's going to require that if we have a component in there, such as an air conditioning system or a boiler that's outdated, it should be noted in the study that you should look at the energy savings of going to a higher efficiency piece of equipment. It's not the reserve provider who's going to do that. I will tell you that my firm, for example, once in a while does what I call a green reserve study, where the green reserve study not only includes the cost of replacement, but the cost of energy. And based on that, we make recommendations for higher efficiency piece of equipment, but it's not a requirement of preparing the study, but it should be noted in the study. And that's something you may want to take a look at, because if you look at the life cycle cost of our buildings, the cost of energy can be 30 to 40% of your annual budget, especially if you're talking about a high rise. So reducing your energy costs, even if you're increasing the replacement costs, can be more than offset by doing that. Keep in mind that sometimes it was said that you should not include a capital improvement out of your reserve funds. In this case, it doesn't fall within the definition of a capital improvement, and it should be done or noted in the study. And it says when evaluating equipment replacement, in many cases, the increase in cost of equipment for efficiency will be more than offset by the reduction in energy cost. And don't forget this website, I always mention it. It's called dsireusa.org. If you go to that website, you're going to see this map that's in the background of this page. On that map, you click on any state, and it's going to give you a list of every incentive that's available to upgrade to energy efficient equipment. So it's a great website. You should take a look at it if you're replacing any equipment. Also keep in mind that the average break-even period, if you upgrade to a higher efficiency piece of equipment and your energy costs go down, the average break-even period for upgrading is for an HVAC system, heating, ventilating, air conditioning, is in the range of 5 to 10 years. But keep in mind that that doesn't include any incentives. It doesn't include the amount you've accumulated in your reserve to date for that, for the replacement of equipment. So in many, many cases, you can replace with a higher efficiency piece of equipment and not have to change the amount you're setting aside for it in reserves, even though you have a big change in your energy costs. They drop down significantly by taking into account the amount you have in your reserve fund and incentives. Also keep in mind, to do this, it may be beneficial to do it before the time frame on your equipment runs out. For example, if you have 5 years left on a boiler, you may want to look at it now, because the energy savings by doing it now, even though you haven't collected 100% of the money to do it, is offset by the cost of the amount that you get in incentives and the energy savings. So it's not something you really need to wait to do. You should take a look at it sooner rather than later. The effect on the reserve study, it could result in lower life cycle costs by doing these type of things. It also is when it comes to maintenance. When it comes to maintenance, you don't have to replace, for example, in this example, wood deck with wood deck. Wood deck requires maintenance, and it has a useful life of maybe 15, 20 years. There's no problem with replacing with something like a composite decking that results in no maintenance and a much longer useful life. So there's no problem, you can't do that. And also from a life cycle cost perspective, that could result in lower life cycle costs. The wording for this in terms of looking at alternatives like I'm talking about was not included in the original reserve study standards, but now it's included in the current reserve study standards. Some people may have done it, but now it's very specific that when the reserve specialists or anyone around the country who use these standards do a study, they should take this into account. When it comes to that, for example, if I'm not mistaken, there's about 300 reserve specialists around the country. But most legislation that I see, when they say that's the requirements of somebody doing the reserve study, what they say is it should be a reserve specialist per the CAI standards. it should be another type of reserve specialist based on another standard, or it should be a licensed engineer or a licensed architect. So those, but in most cases, irrespective of any of that, it says that whoever does it should base the study on the reserve study standards of CAI. So keep that in mind, that these are the standards that are going to be used throughout the industry, even if it's not an RS who's preparing the study. And that's based on a lot of the legislative things that I've seen. For example, that's what it says in New Jersey and Delaware. What about things that you can't see? Another big change in the standards. It used to be that the things were included on the reserve study were things that you can see. So if you visually saw it, so you can evaluate the condition, it was included. But we came to the recognition very clearly based on this paper put out by CAI called Breaking Point, Examining Aging Infrastructures and Community Associations, that there are a lot of things that are behind the walls, plumbing, electrical system, riser pipes, all kinds of things that you can't see. They have not been included in the reserve study, and it results in a special assessment. So the standards now very clearly say, in many cases, components may not be tangible objects or visually observable, yet should still be considered for inclusion in the study based on the expertise of the reserve specialist. So what do you do about including these things if you can't see them to tell what they are? You can look at the architectural and engineering drawings to figure it out. You could and do an estimate based on that. You could take a percentage of the total replacement costs and say that that percentage is for things behind the wall. The other thing, which I'm going to touch on later, you have to be very careful to pay attention to your funding plans, because your funding plans are places where, based on the threshold you establish, which I think you all know what I mean, based on the threshold you establish, will help you come up with the money if something happens that to something that you couldn't see. But how you establish that threshold is going to change to be based on that. The effect on the reserve study, it could result in higher funding requirements. All right, how do you recognize structure and maintenance? I told you that there's a connection between structure and maintenance that is now included in the standards. One is by disclosure and one is by money. So let me tell you what they are. When it comes to maintenance, the standards say that one of the disclosures and the information you need to get from your client is any information they have in regard to whether or not they have a preventive maintenance program in place. If they do not have a preventive maintenance program in place, the reserve provider is most likely going to reduce the useful lives of the components in their community on the reserve study, because they won't last as long if they're not maintained. Direct connection between preventive maintenance and useful lives, and I'll get into how that affects life cycle costs in a few minutes. But that is a disclosure and a direct impact on useful lives. So from industry standards or research I've done, for example, at a minimum, if you don't do preventive maintenance, you're probably reducing the useful lives by at least 10 to 20%, which has a big impact if you're collecting money for replacement over, let's say, 15 years instead of 20 years. This is very specific in there. In regards to the structural inspections, the periodic and structural inspections are recommended as included in the public policy paper. And it says that when you do a reserve study, even though you're not inspecting the structure, that the reserve study needs to include the fact that you need the structural integrity inspection, the cost of it, and the frequency of it. So the result could be an increase in funding. Now you're all sitting back and saying, what buildings need it? How often do I have to do it? And how much it's going to cost? So what the public policy says is that essentially that this is for buildings that have what's known as a primary load bearing system, which is a whole other seminar I'd be happy to give if you want to stay for another hour. But it's a primary load bearing system made up of concrete, steel, masonry, hybrid structural system, blah, blah, blah. That's the type of structures that need to be included for periodic inspections. The legislation I'm involved in New Jersey and Delaware specifically use that definition of what needs to be inspected. It's different in Florida. That's a whole other seminar that I think I'm giving in a week or so about what is a structural reserve study. What does it mean? Because that's one of the requirements right now in the state of Florida, but I'm not going to touch on that. But as far as the frequency of the inspections, for buildings less than 20 years old, these periodic inspections are done a maximum of every 10 years. For buildings more than 20 years old, it's a maximum of every 5 years. So, and the reason why it's more frequent as buildings get older is because they deteriorate faster as they get older. You need to look at them more often. The reason why it says maximum of 10 years or maximum of 5 years, because when you have a structural integrity inspection done, it will tell you if you can wait the full 10 years or full 5 years. But in most cases, from the ones we've done, it may be a maximum of 10 years, but based on the conditions we say that the next inspection should be less than that. The cost of these inspections should be included in the reserve study. Without going into a huge amount of detail, this is what's called a preliminary structural evaluation. There are standards for doing it. And if you want to, on the side, call me and I'll tell me what kind of building you have, and I can tell you approximate cost for doing that to include in the reserve study. But the reserve providers are going to need to know that to include in the reserve study. Other thing to keep in mind, I defined for you what corrective maintenance is. When these structural integrity inspections are done, in most instances, corrective maintenance is identified. The studies or these structural integrity inspections are supposed to include what the corrective maintenance is that's required, when it needs to be done, and obviously if the building's falling down, you got to do it now, when it needs to be done, and the approximate cost of doing it. That structural integrity inspection report needs to be given to the reserve provider so the corrective maintenance cost can be included in the reserve study. One of the changes about this is that this is not a cyclical replacement. Most people look at reserve components as something that every certain number of years will require replacement, like a roof every 20 years. The standards are very clear now that it does not have to be a cyclical replacement. And one prime example of that is corrective maintenance, where you go in and fix it, and hopefully you don't have to do it again, but that cost is included in the reserve study. The effect on the reserve study is obviously can result in an increase in the funding. All right, now updating the reserve study. I mentioned before at the beginning that the best practice is that a reserve study should be updated every 3 years, a maximum of every 5 years. I will say that there's also is based on the study, because those are maximums. For example, if your community is doing what you all know as baseline funding, it should be updated every year, because baseline is a dangerous thing to do. But the effect on the reserve study, the cost of the reserve study should be included in the study. The result would be an increase in funding, but I don't really think that it's going to be much of an increase, because the reserve study updates are not that expensive. And also a lot of associations do the reserve study updates at any effect, but now you have a place where it's going to be on the reserve study. And when you're reviewing your reserve study each year, you'll see that it will say in there you should update it. Also keep in mind that when the reserve study is done, the preventive maintenance evaluation should be updated prior to the reserve study, so the person who's doing the updates knows whether or not you're doing preventive maintenance and how it impacts on the useful lives of the components. What does adequacy mean? This has changed. This has changed because most of you understand what a baseline funding is. Baseline funding essentially says that over a 30-year cash flow projection period, your fund for your reserve should not go below zero. And if it's at zero or anything above that, that is adequate funding. That definition has changed. And here's what the definition is. A replacement reserve fund and stable, equitable, multi-year funding plan that together provide for the reliable and timely execution of major repairs and replacement without additional funding. And ideal funding goals should be based on adequate funding. It has to take into account things behind the walls, anything like that, so that going down to baseline is the most critical, and baseline is not defined as adequate funding anymore. It's going to be more than that. But it's based on your building and what your reserve provider says. But keep in mind, the effect on the reserve study is adequacy does not mean baseline funding, and the result could be an increase in funding. I have to mention also that there are a number of legislative requirements in states or statutory requirements, such as New Jersey, which I'm going to get into in a second, where specifically define adequacy as baseline funding. And so if you're doing a reserve study in the state of New Jersey, and I'll touch on it in a second, adequacy is still defined as baseline. And I'll go into that second. I have a funny feeling in the next couple of years it may change legislatively, but right now it says that. And it also says the same thing for developers as part of their governing documents. So the definition of adequacy is really a little bit up in the air right now. Or not up in the air, but not defined as baseline. The preparer qualifications, not changed. It's an individual with the RS designation, reserve specialist designation is the most qualified. Standard of care, there's now a standard of care in the reserve study standards that say reserve study providers should only take on reserve studies that they have expertise in. For example, a high-rise building is much more complex than a townhouse community. So the reserve specialist should not take on an assignment like that unless they have experience doing it. It could result in additional cost of the study because for a high-rise building or a building with a lot of complex things in it, you need a higher level of expertise in order to evaluate the condition and what should be included in the reserve study. But this is included now. Before, there was no standard of care for the reserve provider. Now let's talk about the maintenance challenge. Let's get into maintenance a little. This is a quote: unlike commercial buildings, unlike office buildings, unlike city and county buildings, unlike residential homes and apartment buildings, condo associations have no standardized baseline maintenance protocol. This is not true anymore. And you'll see who that was referenced to. But that quote is going to be changed because one of the specific reasons that CAI did the best practices report on maintenance is so that we do have a standard baseline maintenance protocol. What is maintenance planning made up of? So we're all clear on the definitions. It's based on a maintenance plan, which lists inspections, the preventive maintenance work that should be done, as well as the budget. So, for example, in New Jersey, the statutory requirement is going to change that when a developer does the governing documents, it's not only going to include a reserve study, but it needs to include a maintenance manual that includes this for budgeting purposes. And the new legislation says that associations have to do this, which I'll show you in a second. The maintenance program is the implementation when you actually perform the inspections and perform the preventive maintenance. A maintenance plan is just a list of all the things you need to inspect, when you inspect them, and the approximate cost to do it. A maintenance program, again, is the when you should actually do the work. Is it yearly, is it quarterly, is it annually, and when you should do the work and what the work is. From a life cycle cost of maintenance, this slide always jumps for some reason. It's estimated that the cost of maintenance, preventive maintenance, is approximately 4 to 5% of the replacement cost. So if you take something that has $100,000 replacement cost, the average cost of preventive maintenance for that component, so it attains its full useful life, is about 4 to 5% of that cost. Again, like I mentioned before, if you have to do corrective maintenance because you have not done preventive maintenance, it's 30 times the cost at a minimum. And there's the reference for that. There's a lot of references in the industry for this. The life cycle costs with preventive maintenance. This is another industry. When I did my research, I found a well-implemented preventive maintenance program can typically result in cost savings of 15 to 30% of the total life cycle costs. Another huge value of doing preventive maintenance. So the effect on the reserve study, it could result in lower life cycle costs. These requirements are going to happen even without the changes to the standards. And why I say that is this is a map of the United States. The blue states have reserve study and their funding requirements. The green states have statutory guidance for reserves. And the khaki states do not have statutory requirements. More and more states are coming out with reserve study requirements of those states. And in most cases, those reserve study requirements are also tied into doing preventive maintenance. So legislatively, I don't have these in the left-hand side in the proper order because my experience with the legislative requirements is that should be on the bottom of the list because in different states, depending on who the different constituencies are, the requirements are going to be different and it's not going to be consistent because I see that very clearly between New Jersey and Delaware when I'm involved in both. But there's some other places where requirements are going to come from, such as Fannie and Freddie in the lending requirements and insurance, which I'll touch on as part of this. So they're all connected. They're all going to make us do what we're talking about. From the state of New Jersey requirements, there's a bill out there right now that's moving through the legislative process, so to speak. It was sponsored by Senator Singleton, who I got to meet a few times, an absolute gentleman. And this legislation is based directly on the CAI public policy. It includes periodic inspections, maintenance, reserve studies, reserve funding. I'm not going to touch on the periodic inspection part of it, but I do want to show you what the New Jersey legislation is going to require if this passes, and I think there's a good chance that it passes for community associations. So let's start with, it's required to obtain a reserve study and funding. So it says an association created pursuant to this legislation shall obtain a reserve study, including a 30-year funding plan, in order to ensure that the association has adequate reserve funds available to repair or replace the capitalized assets located on the common elements of facilities that the association is obligated to maintain. Now, here's where adequacy comes from, without need to create a special assessment or loan obligation. So what it's saying is that baseline funding is okay. That's what the legislation is going to say. This is actually taken directly from it. I do not see this wording changing if it passes. All right. What if you don't have a reserve study currently, or you have one that's more than 5 years old? Associations which have not undertaken a reserve study within 5 years of the effective date of this legislation shall undertake a reserve study within 1 year of the effective date. So you saw before when I was talking that most of you guys have, but I'm kind of preaching to the wrong people sometimes. But most of you have reserve studies are less than 5 years old, so you're not going to have to update it when this legislation comes into place. But somewhere else in here, if I'm not mistaken, it says that once you have one, it does have to be updated a maximum every 5 years. But there's going to be a lot of associations that don't have reserves that are going to have to do it. So now we talk about adequacy. What is it? What it is? What does it say? If you're not adequately funded, and it has an impact of 10% or more on your overall operating budget, not just on the reserves, but the overall operating budget. So if your revenues or your maintenance fee have to go up 10% or more because you're not adequately funded, the legislation says you'll have 10 fiscal years to catch up, or you have the amount of time between now and when the fund goes into a deficit to catch up, which clearly you're gonna have to do anyway, because let's say you're more than 10%, but a roof has to be replaced in 5 years and you're running through deficit. You're not going to wait 5-10 years to become adequately funded. You have to become adequately funded by the time that roof has to be replaced, or you're going to need a special assessment or borrowing. So it says 10 years if it's more than 10% impact, or the period of time until the next component has to be replaced that brings you into deficit. If it affects less than 10% of your annual budget, you're going to have 2 years to become to adequacy, not 10 years. But this is only if it affects less than 10% of your budget. Qualifications. Qualifications is, again, that it has to be done by a reserve specialist who's credentialed to the CAI, or an engineer or architect who's licensed by the state. And it goes on to what should be included, what the qualifications are. It also says the anticipated cost associated with the building maintenance, as well as the cost of repair or replacement, should be included in the budget. So when you're doing this, you're not doing reserves only, but you have to take into account maintenance, what I've been talking about. Inclusion of update costs. Again, I mentioned it says you have to include in your reserve study the cost to update it, and if any corrective maintenance takes place, that's to go into your reserve study. All right, so that's what the legislation in New Jersey says, which again is similar to Delaware, slightly different but similar. Now, what do Fannie and Freddie say currently? They say on the condominium project questionnaire, it says, couple of questions. Does the project have a funding plan for its deferred maintenance components, items to be repaired or replaced? Yes or no? So one of the things they're looking for currently on their addendum is, do you have a reserve study and do you fund for maintenance? Because that affects the risk and their willingness to I guess, underwrite or back a mortgage for a refinance or a purchase. Does the project have a schedule for the deferred maintenance components, items to be repaired or replaced? Again, yes or no? If yes, provide this schedule. So this questionnaire asks for the schedule if you have one. And clearly, if you don't have one, it's going to reflect on the risk that you present. Has the HOA or co-op corp had a reserve study completing the project within the past 3 years? So they're also looking for how current is the reserve study. I will also tell you that I've been involved with Fannie and Freddie. I've had the opportunity through CAI to meet with them specifically about this questionnaire and what it says. And there are going to be some changes coming. I don't know how long it's going to take based on how our government works, but you can anticipate there will be some changes to clean up what's out there, because there's a recognition that it's not easy to work with. And so there are going to be some changes coming in terms of what they define as safety, how safety is quantified, reserve studies, a few things, but this is going to change. I just don't know when. What does Fannie say? In their Fannie lender letter, it says that it used to be that Fannie said that you can either provide a reserve study that's less than, I think it was 2 years old, or set aside 10% of your annual operating budget into reserves, whichever is less. They have taken out in the reserve requirements a reserve study as being something that qualifies the amount you set aside, and now it's only based on 10% of the budget. Seems kind of backwards to me, I got to tell you, because I would think that a reserve study is much more reflective of what the community is than to say 10% of the budget, because you could have a high-rise and a townhouse community. The annual budget's $3 million, and one has much less common elements. So In one, the 10% of the budget may be way high, and the other may be way low. But I think a reserve study is a little more appropriate. But that's what it says now. As far as Freddie still allows you, as far as I know, to use the 10% rule or a reserve study. All right, now let's look at an insurance application. This is sample condo insurance application. What does it say? Has a reserve study or a plan for funding major maintenance projects been done? Yes or no? Indicate any existing maintenance contracts, the grounds maintenance and snow removals. The point I'm making here, because I've spoken to some people who are experts in condominium insurance, and it is definitely something that they look for when it comes to the risk of underwriting a condominium with insurance. If I'm not mistaken, some things are going to be happening in regards to safety also, but right now most of them reflect specifically on reserves and maintenance. So the things I'm showing you show that there are requirements to do this, even if it's not legislation, and everybody's going to have to do it. So how do you do it? I have to introduce, this is a word that I've come up with. It's called strategy. What does strategy mean? It's strategic synergy. Synergy means that you look at something and how do you benefit from adding them together rather than looking at them separately. When it comes to what we're talking about, reserves, energy, maintenance, structure, and all these things, I came up with the term strategy, which means you can't look at them independently. You have to integrate them together in order to get the most efficient, lowest life cycle costs, while at the same time maintain maintenance, structural safety, and low life cycle costs. So what do? You integrate the things together. You do a reserves with a reserve study, and keep in mind, which I'm going to touch on, that in a reserve study, the funding plan is a big part of your evaluation. You look at the energy costs with an energy cost evaluation. You look at maintenance with a preventive maintenance plan and structural safety with periodic inspections. So what's the goal? To maximize your property values, to minimize your life cycle costs, and to maintain a safe community. From a life cycle cost impact, I'm going to give you an actual example. But preventive maintenance is estimated 5% of replacement costs, and useful life reductions, as I mentioned, without preventive maintenance, corrective maintenance is 30 times the cost. So what do? Number one, review your current reserve study to evaluate the life cycle cost impact of maintenance. Step one, add 5% to your reserve fund. Take the total replacement cost of all your components, add 5% to it, and distribute it over the funding plan timeframe for your association. So add 5%, distribute it, and then determine what your total 30-year costs are without touching your useful lives. That's number one. Step two, don't add the cost of preventive maintenance. Reduce the useful lives at 10% for all static components, such as roofs, decks, these kind of things, and reduce the useful lives at 20% for all mechanical equipment. Now determine the total 30-year cost. Step three, compare the results. Keep in mind, and I'm going to show you an actual example, but keep in mind, this does not include the cost of corrective maintenance if you have to fix something, which is 30 times the cost of preventive maintenance. So it doesn't include that. So the difference you're going to see is going to be very low. Step four, review the funding plan options. Now, here's an example of a picture of the connection between reserves, maintenance, and structure. This is what's called a podium deck. And the podium deck is, let's see. The podium deck is something that up here that's underneath the building that may cover up a parking garage or something. The podium deck is something that's included on the reserve study for replacing the membrane, replacing the patio blocks, whatever's there. And it needs to be maintained so that the useful life is not reduced and so water doesn't get through. Because what happens if water gets through? The structure is protected by the podium deck above. So if you don't maintain the podium deck, what's going to happen? A reduction in useful lives, which is going to cost you more, but now water is going to get through and affect the structure of the building, which is going to have a significant cost to replace. So this is the connection to everything in a picture. But now let's see, what's an example in actual dollars? This is a high-rise. This is a high-rise reserve study we did. 30 stories, 309 units, 45 years old. You know what this looks like. This is the summary. This is the physical analysis listing all the components. So what did we do? Example one, we added the cost of preventive maintenance. What we did is, in this case, we added 4% of the total replacement cost. Since this building is older, some of the components go up to a 50-year life. We talked about adding components as the building gets older. So I took 4% of the total replacement cost, divided it over that 50 years, and I used the full useful life of all the components. That's step one. Step two, I didn't include the cost of preventive maintenance. I reduced the life to 10% on the physical components and 20% on the equipment, exactly what I said. So what's the result? Without preventive maintenance, the cost over 30 years was $33,849,000. With preventive maintenance at 5%, it was $31,800,000, a savings of over $2 million by putting into place a preventive maintenance program and integrating everything together rather than looking at them separately. So this, again, does not include having to fix things where it costs so much more. But you also need to take a look at your funding plans. Now, you all know what this looks like. In this case, the red means what happens if you keep going. You're going to run into a big deficit pretty quickly. The green means baseline funding, which brings you down to zero. The blue means full funding. What you can do in here, and what you should do is, you don't have to jump to full funding. It's over funding. That's a whole other seminar. You shouldn't be a baseline, bring it down to zero because it's a little risky. But what you can do is evaluate your funding, how much you're setting aside, what's it going to take to ramp up to get to where adequate funding is based on all the things I've talked about. But the funding plan is a very important thing that you really need to look at to come up with a plan that meets your association that doesn't break the bank, so to speak. But by doing that, you really need to look at everything else. You need to look at energy, maintenance, all the things together. And by doing that, you'll maximize your property values, you'll minimize your life cycle costs, and you'll get to safety. Now, how do you do that for an association? And I'm going to give you an example because I like to think that I generally don't do a sales pitch as part of my presentations, but I want to show you something that we're doing. We've come up with a program called the Kipcon Hybrid Community Program. And what it specifically does is it integrates everything together. And we've been using this logo for years, which actually shows how everything is integrated together. But when we prepare a reserve study for you, we'll estimate your potential life cycle cost savings based on the things I talked about: reduction, useful life, preventive maintenance, all that things. And we'll provide recommendations for developing what I call the strategy program for your community. We're strategically coming up with what are the synergies for your community. And what does that result in? Because everybody clearly from the original questionnaire is looking at money. What's the result? You add together reserves, energy, preventive maintenance, and structural integrity inspections. You look at everything together. And if you look at them independently, it's going to be 1 + 1 = 4. But if you look at everything together, you're going to have a hybrid community where it's going to cost you much less in life cycle costs by looking at everything together, not separately. So our vision for your community is, and your vision for the community is, and from the questionnaire at the beginning, minimizing life cycle costs goes on the top, safety goes second, and maximizing property values goes third, but all three of them there. That's the vision for your community. And now that is, did I make it on time? What time is it? All right. I went over, 1 minute early. I didn't think I'd get there that fast. So if anybody has any questions, or if there's anything in the chat room, I'd be more than happy to answer any questions you might have now. And
yeah, Mitch, there's a few questions.
Okay.
So Andrew Newman, how is it determined what level of a replacement is used as a standard for the reserve study, such as fully replacing the asphalt in the streets versus replacing the top 2 inches of asphalt?
Well, that very specific question, that's for sure. Most associations, when they do asphalt work, they do what's called milling down the surface and putting a new 2-inch top on it. I've never been involved in an association where they totally replace the roads, unless when you mill off the top, there's significant damage underneath. When we put together a reserve study or do a spec for roadway replacement, we always include the cost of milling, the cost of the new 2-inch cap, and we always include contingency because you will always find damage underneath. That's going to cost you additional money, but I can't remember anywhere we find anything with the total base course had it replaced at part of that. We've done some where a lot of it did, but I can't remember one where it totally had to be replaced.
Okay, so Stephen Marcus should a non-engineer reserve specialist comment on visible signs of structural issues such as falling, not as experts? Oh, okay.
That's a great question. I could see he's trying to put me on the spot. I see that smile on his face. It's a great question because it's a liability issue. I think, for example, if we start commenting, I don't really I know what we do in our office. If we see something that scares us, we will notify the client immediately in writing. But I will tell you that I've been involved in all the RSs across the country. This is a big fear level from them from a risk perspective. Because as soon as you see one thing and you say something, they're going to start thinking you looked at everything. You really have to put in, there's something in the reserve study standards in terms of a indemnification clause to put in. I'm a firm believer that if you see something, you got to say something, but disclose that you didn't look at everything when you happened to see this. We had somebody out doing a reserve study from my office a couple of weeks ago where they were in a parking garage and they were underneath the parking garage and they saw that there were a couple of steel posts holding up the deck because the steel beams were so rusted that it looked like it was going to collapse. And he says to me, what do I do? So I tell you what I did. I immediately called the manager, the owner of the management company, told him about it and said, you are at risk if you don't do anything about this. He knew about it. They had requested structural design specifications months ago and nothing was done. But I immediately called, sent something in writing. The other thing I've done is if they're not going to do something, I'll call the local building inspector. I'll tell them that there's a safety issue, but it's a great question because most RSs are paranoid about the risk of starting to identify things. So, Steve, you're an attorney from Massachusetts. Why don't you unmute yourself and say from a legal perspective what you recommend an association do or that somebody like us do? I will tell you, Steve does not speak in sentences. We're going to be here for another hour and a half, but go ahead.
So I was born in a small cabin. From a legal perspective, representing thousands of condominium associations over the decades, I want the reserve study specialist. Well, first of all, maybe a plug for you. My ideal would be to have you, who meets both the reserve specialist and engineering criteria, to do the inspection, because I know my client will get the full picture. I want the reserve specialist, if they see spalling of the concrete or some other telltale signs beyond not going into destructive testing, I want them to disclose it to me somehow. Now, I don't care whether they leave it out of the report and call me up and say, or call the manager up and say, I noticed 3 things. There's some water in the garage that looks like it's doing something unhealthy. You really should bring in a structural engineer. But my goal is not to put the reserve study specialist in danger, but to off the record report to the manager the issues so that the manager can bring in the structural engineer to investigate further and say, this is an issue or this is not an issue.
Okay, thank you. I'm in agreement with you that I would rather say something than walk away and next day something happens and then they say, you saw it, you should have said something. So I agree with that opinion. By the way, Steve is a very prominent attorney up in Massachusetts for many, many years. He's a friend of mine through CAI. We've worked on the public policy and a million things together. And actually, if anybody is interested in this topic in a little more detail about structural integrity, Steve is giving a webinar. It's called the Markets Hour next Friday at 9 o'clock or 10 o'clock.
10 o'clock.
10 o'clock. And I'm
By Zoom.
By Zoom, and I'm one of the panelists on that.
No, you are the guest speaker.
I am the guest speaker.
You are the world-renowned structural engineer for community associations, and we want you to have the floor, so you know that I'm going to interrupt you and take up half the time. I also want to point out that that was a historic moment we had a minute ago when Mitch said he agreed. Is the first time since Surfside since we ever have. So I appreciate that. We're gaining ground.
Well, as we get older, Steve is starting to say things that are correct. Does anybody else have any questions or anything? By the way,
Yeah,
that's
Mitch, there's
Steve's
a few
son
more.
that's Steve's son down there that's hoping I won't introduce him as Steve's son. But that's Jake down there. He's an attorney who's going to be on that program next week also.
I'll
sorry.
probably have to mediate that whole conversation between you two.
That's for sure. Any other questions, George?
Jessica Smith wants to know where she can find the state-specific statutory suggestions.
Oh, good question. If you go to the CAI website and caionline.org, do a search for reserve studies. What's going to happen is it's going to bring you to a map, that map of the United States I showed you. And there's a link on the right-hand side that will bring you to all of the different states and what the requirements are, if they have any in regard to reserve studies. So it's caionline.org.
Jim Yost, how does Fannie Mae define deferred maintenance? And how does answering no affect the application?
Well, I'll go to number 2 first. As far as how they respond to that no on the application, I can't tell you. But they have, if you look at it, and I'd be happy to send it to you, they have a very, I was going to say clear, they have a definition of maintenance. It's not that clear. As far as I know, if I remember correctly, Fannie and Freddie's definitions don't match, but they're trying to become consistent on them. And I think that's one of the things you're going to see, because I think the addendum actually right now is the same addendum for both of them. But if you want, just let me know, email us, and I'd be happy to share with you their definitions of what they mean by that in terms of all this stuff. If you go to their website and try and find it, you never will. It's a very confusing website, but I've got them and I'd be happy to share them.
And does the Fannie Mae questionnaire apply to single-family homes and 2-level townhomes?
Well, it's interesting, and Steve, correct me if I'm wrong, because you're an expert on this. It applies to any community with buildings in which there are 5 or more attached units. And my understanding from talking to them is if you have a community with 500 units and there's just one building there with 5 or more attached units, it then applies to the entire community, not just that building. Steve, am I correct?
That's my understanding as well. But I've offended Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac and FHFA and FHA over the years, so they probably talk more to you than they do to me.
Just so you know, Fannie and Freddie are not government organizations, but they're run by FHFA, Federal Housing Finance Association, or something like that. So they follow they report to them, but they're not government agencies, if I'm not mistaken.
No, that is correct. They're quasi-governmental, but everybody thinks they're the government. But they are petrified of FHFA, because FHFA, which is conservator for 14 years of Fannie and Freddie, is in fact the government and is in fact very tough. So I'm assuming that if Mitch is speaking to them, he's loosening them up.
Well, I had the opportunity I was invited to DC to a meeting of the representatives of Fannie and Freddie and the people who represented FHFA that oversee them. And I have to tell you that every one of them, they were very sharp. Every one of them wanted the same thing. Every one of them are caught in a system that it ain't easy to make it happen. And the gentleman who heads them up from FHFA was an absolute nice man. And he's emailed me and reached out to me a few times. So they are trying, but they're caught in a system, which is called our government. So.
Okay, one more question. Do you know if there's efforts in Connecticut to add New Jersey-like reserve requirements in the statute?
I am not aware of it, but if you look at that website, it'll show, but I'm not aware of it, to be honest with you. There are a number of states. Connecticut is not one that I heard about, and usually the ones that are very close, I hear all about. Any other questions, comments, anything?
I put my email address in the chat. It's jsmallwood@kipcon.com if anybody would like a certificate for CEU credits.
And I don't know if you saw Stephen Marcus's thing. He said, do you have any upcoming comedy gigs at the Improv in New York City or otherwise? And Steve, it wasn't the Improv, it was the Metropolitan Room and the Gotham Club. So you have to get the places right. So, but if anybody has any questions, feel free to email us. Andrew Newman, that smile hasn't left your face in an hour and a half. I don't know how you hold that position, but it looks good. And thank you, everybody, for attending. We'll have some more webinars coming up. If you ever have any suggestions for a webinar that we should give, please feel free to reach out to us. And if anybody would like to attend next week's Markets Hour, if you email us, we'd be happy to give you the link. And you may have gotten it from us already, but the link to attend that Zoom webinar, we'd love to have you join us. So
It's in the chat.
Jody posted it. She's quicker than both of us.
okay.
Actually, Jake did it.
All
So
right.
it's in the
Thank you very
chat.
much, everybody. Have a great day. It's been a pleasure. Take care. Thanks, Steve, for bailing me out. Bye, everyone.